can come to the house and see you there.
It'll be very good indeed.
Good.
I usually find that people are far better looking in reality than they are on Zoom. So that's excellent.
Well, I don't know. I think this is deceiving, the Zoom. When you'll see me much older than what I am now. And I just disconnected myself.
Okay, I think we will start the event now. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our online event on citizenship revocation in Bahrain. This event is hosted by Mr. Wayne David, Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom and Shadow of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Minister for Middle East and North Africa. My name is Candice, and I'm an advocacy assistant at the European Center for Democracy and Human Rights. Today, I have the pleasure of co-moderating this event together with my colleague Sabiha. We have gathered together a high-level panel to discuss the harmful consequences and abusive resort to citizenship revocation in Bahrain. We will firstly hear from our host, Wayne David, who is going to talk about citizenship as an international individual right guaranteed within the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and his view on the situation in Bahrain and UK's implications. Next, we will have our excellent panelist and expert, Dr. Saeed Al-Shahabi. Dr. Al-Shahabi has over 40 years of expertise and commitment in pro-democracy movements in Bahrain and is also a victim of citizenship revocation. We're also pleased to welcome Sabrina Benoui, who's the head of the Middle East desk at Reporters Without Borders, who will be focusing on press freedom and repression of journalists in Bahrain. Our next panelist will include Zara Al-Baradzi, co-coordinator of Hawiyari, who's going to speak about statelessness more generally and give an insight to the topic on a more international scale. We will then hear from Emna Sayadi, Advocacy and Network Engagement Officer at Civicus, speaking about cybercrime and laws. And finally, we will have a speech from Raid Jarar, the Director of Advocacy at Dawn, who will give a more regional perspective on the topic. Without further ado, I yield the floor to our host, Wayne David.
Thank you very much indeed, Candice, and could I give a very warm welcome to everyone. Speaking as I am the Labour Shadow Minister for the Middle East and North Africa. Over the past 18 months or so, since the new Shadow team has been together and I've been in post, I work closely with a number of organizations who are passionately concerned about human rights in Bahrain. Amongst those are the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights, who have organized today's event. Now, as the Labour Party's Foreign Affairs team, we have done our best over the past 18 months to press a number of cases of individuals who have been the victims of repressive measures by the Bahraini government. We have, for instance, called for the unconditional release of Hassan Mochema and Dr. Al Singazi, who has ended his 5th month on hunger trial and strike. This event today has to be seen in a broad context of the abuse and denial of human rights in Bahrain. Since the pro-democracy protests in 2011, we have seen the prosecution of hundreds of political and human rights and activists and journalists, and the state behaving in a profoundly undemocratic way. This discussion today focuses on one reprehensible aspect of the Bahraini government's suppression of human rights activists, namely citizenship revocation. Being a citizen of a country is, I believe, a fundamental right, underpinned by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is most definitely not a privilege which can be granted and easily taken away. Unfortunately, it is the case that the Bahraini government has revoked the citizenship of many hundreds of individuals, and many of those individuals still remain stateless today. Those people committed no crime. They were simply upholders of human rights and democracy. Now, I believe such actions need to be condemned without equivocation, and those individuals who have suffered need to have their rights restored, and compensation really ought to be given for the suffering that has been caused. Unfortunately, in my view, the British government has not done enough in this area. Now, I understand the economic and political ties between Britain and Bahrain, but Britain as a country which says it believes in democracy and the rule of law has a government which ought to be saying very clearly about what is going on is not acceptable. Now, that is the message which Labour is articulating consistently and loudly in the British Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David, for that insightful presentation. We hope that the UK government takes a supportive stance with the pro-democracy movement in Bahrain and ultimately calls for the atrocities in Bahrain to cease. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Saeed Al-Shahabi to speak about his experience with his citizenship being revoked and how he has continuously addressed the issues of human rights under the dictatorship. I think you're on mute, Dr. Saeed.
Okay, sorry again. Thank you, Sabiha, for this introduction, and thank you, Mr. David, for these illuminating and sincere words. We have worked with you for some time, and we know how humane your words are, and we have worked with the Labour Party before, and we hope that the Conservatives will take a more humane attitude and approach to our case in Bahrain. I will just illuminate some points here. Three main headings. The first one is the revocation of nationality. The government of Bahrain uses three tactics in order to punish the opposition figures. Revocation of nationality, banishment, and political naturalization. These three means are almost specific to the government of Bahrain. You don't see other countries, other governments use it, removing the citizenship of their citizens. Rarely you find this happening anywhere. Banishment also, governments do not usually put their citizens on airplanes and send them away. And then political naturalization. You do not see other governments usually distributing and importing citizens from abroad, bringing people from abroad and giving them citizenship in order to alter the balance, the population balance in the country. So these three specific points and policies have been adopted by the regime in Bahrain for years. And this makes it a unique government, a unique government. Why? Because it is not a modern statehood, it is a tribal leadership that is using its antiquated ideas to run a state. In the past 50 years, after the British withdrew, we had hoped that we would be transformed into a modern statehood, into a modern state. But in reality, we have remained backward, and we have remained being subjected to a tribal mentality and leadership. So we have, in addition to other countries, we have systematic torture. And in fact, we are this month, we are marking the 10th year after the writing up of the what we call the Basuni report in 2011, in which they said that the torture was systematic, was as a systematic tool of repression against the people. So we have systematic torture. Of course, other countries also use it. We have small native country population which cannot take many more. We are a small population, but the natives are paying the dearer price for opposing the regime. We have harsh prisons. Until today, we have about at least 1,500 political prisoners. Just to put it in proportion, Israel has about 7,000 political prisoners. So Bahrain, with 1,500 political prisoners, it is taking more than its share. Another point in this, and then I will move to the second point, is that recently Oman, the Sultanate Oman, which is a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, released the prisoners it had for a few years. They just opened their prisons and released their prisoners. And only yesterday, Kuwait took the decision to release to release its political prisoners and to issue a general amnesty to almost everybody who have political crimes, they call it. It's not crime, but political cases. So unless, except Bahrain, the government of Bahrain is not undertaking such steps. So this is number one: revocation of nationality, banishment, and political naturalizations as weaponizing them in order to punish the people. The second point is weaponizing the system is wrong. You cannot weaponize, as Wayne David just said, that these are rights. You cannot use them as weapons. You cannot try to punish your adversary by removing his or her citizenship. You cannot just put him or her on an airplane and send them abroad, take them away of the country. You cannot use judiciary as a weapon, but everything in Bahrain is weaponized. Judiciary is not just, is not neutral. The police is not neutral. Employment is not neutral. You are only given a job if you have loyalty to the ruling family. So this is the second point, that weaponizing the rights, the basic natural rights, must not happen, but this is happening. Finally, I want to talk about the political demands, that what we have been talking about is the punishment we are receiving from the regime. Why? Because we have legitimate political rights. We cannot continue to be ruled in this antiquated way. We cannot continue in the 21st century to be ruled by a ruling family which is occupying the most senior posts in the country, and which is putting its hands in almost every department in order to subjugate to the people. This is not right, and the people are not going to stop calling for their political right. And the hope is that the British government, as Wayne David said just now, will shoulder its responsibility. It has been in Bahrain before for 150 years, and for the past 50 years since it left that region, it maintained good and close relations with the regime. In fact, only last week, Boris Johnson met with the Prime Minister of Bahrain. Unfortunately, Mr. Johnson is not calling for the release of the political prisoners, for like Dr. Abdul Jais Singais, who has entered his 5th month on hunger strike. It's Mr. Johnson is not calling for the release of the other political prisoners. He is not calling for political reforms in the country. The hope is that people like you, people like Wayne David and others will play a crucial role in convincing the British government that this ally is not worth having if it is not going to uphold the basic human values. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish all of you play a positive role in supporting the oppressed everywhere, especially in Bahrain.
Thank you, Dr. Saeed, for speaking about citizenship revocation in Bahrain as a weapon used by the authorities. It has been despicable to continuously hear about Bahrainis becoming stateless. Hundreds of human rights activists have had their citizenships revoked over the last decade, and this is not acceptable. I would like now to yield the floor to Sabrina Benoui.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for organizing this event, because I think it's very important to keep the fight for freedom in Bahrain alive, and you are doing a great job. We must not forget what happened and what's still going on in this country. So regarding citizenship revocation, this is a widely used tool to punish those who dared to demonstrate 10 years ago during what we call the Arab Spring. And this is clearly a revenge measure against those people. And what I find very interesting and appalling actually with this is the symbolic behind this. I mean, I'm not talking in legal terms. I'm talking about the violence with this measure, because as a government, when you revoke someone's citizenship, you're basically saying the message you convey to those people is that you're not part of the nation. Your values are not compatible with the nation. Democracy, human rights, press freedom is not compatible with this country. And as long as we're in power, there will never be freedom. And we will never leave. You will have to, actually. And the fact is that this is what happened. Many journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders had to leave the country because they could not fight for freedom inside it. And I must say that whenever I talk about Bahrain to people who are not familiar with Gulf countries or the Middle East in general, I always say that I'm impressed with bloggers and journalists abroad, because they are very active. There's a very active civil society from Bahrain, and they want to fight for freedom outside the country. They want to keep the dream, the project of democracy, human rights, and press freedom alive in their country that they love, and despite the fact that they were subjected to many violations, torture, imprisonment, and so on. And this is, unfortunately, an admission of failure. Why? Because this means that the only way to fight for freedom, press freedom, human rights in Bahrain is to be in exile. Because what's going on now for people inside Bahrain? They're being jailed. At the moment, in Reporters Without Borders, we have monitored 9 cases of journalists imprisoned. Maybe the figure seems not enormous, let's say, but regarding the fact that Bahrain is a very small country and there are not many inhabitants, this is enormous, believe me. When you compare it to Egypt, for example, where there are almost 100 million of inhabitants, there are 30 journalists jailed at the moment. In Bahrain, only in Bahrain, 9 journalists, at least, because this is the number of cases we have managed to document. So it's enormous, it's appalling. And the thing is that the situation has not changed for the past 10 years. The fact that we are not documenting as many violations as we used to in the beginning of the demonstrations doesn't mean that the violations are not still being perpetrated by the authorities. This only means that all the free voices have been silenced completely because they're all in jail. They have been sentenced to long-term imprisonment or life sentences, and they cannot fight now. They're all in jail. And of course, I'm thinking about Abdel Jalil al-Singis, who's been on a hunger strike since July. He's fighting for his life, and he decided to go on a hunger strike just to fight for his basic and fundamental rights. Of course, we call for his release, and we think that his place is not in jail. He should not be in jail at the first place. He should be released, but at least for his health, he should be with his loved ones. I'm thinking also about Mahmoud al-Jaziri, who was the editor-in-chief of Al-Wasat newspaper. This was the only and last independent newspaper in the country, and it has been completely shut down. And a very symbolic gesture from the authorities after they decided to close this newspaper was to destroy the building, the headquarters of this media. So is there any stronger message and symbol than destroying a building where an independent media used to be? I don't think so. And it happened about 2 years ago, as far as I remember. So this shows that it's not only about what happened 10 years ago during the Arab Spring, it's still going on now. So yes, to me and to Reporters Without Borders, the situation of press freedom is appalling. It's a catastrophe, and clearly journalism is dead. But we have reasons to believe that we can still have hopes for Bahrain. Why? Because there are some, let's say, initiatives to push for alternative sentences and to call for the release of all detained journalists, bloggers, and human rights defenders. And when we advocated for Abdel Jalil al-Singis a few months ago, before his hunger strike, the Bahraini authorities responded to us. They denied the fact that he was ill-treated and so on. So we replied back, but there was nothing after this. So we just hope that there will be sincere measures and proceedings to get improvements in the country. But to me and to Reporters Without Borders, there will never be any improvement if there's no real political will from the Bahraini authorities themselves and from the Western countries that can push pressure on the authorities and help us to advocate for human rights and for democracy in the country. So yes, the situation has not significantly changed when we think about Nabil Rajab, for example, who has been released, but he has not his complete free speech, but at least it's better than being jailed. But at the same time, it's improving slowly, but it's improving. And we hope that it will get better. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina, for giving us that intensive speech on the struggles faced by those who have fought for freedom and human rights, especially for that insightful focus on the alternative sentencing program. Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Sengais is one of many cases, as stated by Sabrina, who deserve to live in a democratic country where they are allowed to express their right to freedom of expression. Following that, I would like to welcome Zahra Al-Barazi to speak about statelessness more generally in order to understand the depth of the violation that is citizenship revocation. The floor is yours, Zahra.
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this. It's great to be a part of this panel. I won't take too much time because it would be great to start a discussion. I just wanted to add one thing to this discussion, in that placing it kind of a little bit more in its broader context, the idea of deprivation of nationality and that consequentially leading to statelessness. Unfortunately, addressing statelessness in the region has, for as long as nationality has been a thing, has been a problem. The region has had a very sensitive relationship to the concept of citizenship, often seeing citizenship as more of a gift than a right. Historical challenges we've seen are plentiful. We've seen state succession as one of the biggest problems in ensuring that everybody's got citizenship in the region and in the country. We've seen discrimination as a huge issue, and this is something that we see every day in Bahrain now. One of the major things we have in the region in Bahrain is that of gender discrimination in the nationality laws. And when you combine that with a lot of men who've been arbitrarily deprived of their nationality, these are also leaving new generations of children being stateless, because women can't give their nationality to their children and the father has been deprived of his nationality. So discrimination in laws and in practice is also a huge problem that we see. And then, of course, issues of things like demographic concerns. This is not new, and this has been a huge struggle in terms of the right to nationality across the region. So citizenship really being used as a political tool. It's not also collectively, not as individuals. We've seen the deprivation of nationality collectively of groups of people, a common practice used in the region as well, leaving groups of people such as Kurds in Syria, Kurds in Iraq, stateless and left without nationality for decades. So it really is one of a significant problem that the whole region has been struggling with since the formation of states in the region. And it's also internationally not a new issue either. Before, it was really considered in kind of more the concept of exile. People were taken into exile if if the states decided one day that they no longer wanted that person to be a part of its citizenry, they would be exiled. And we've got cases of denationalization that go back, that we can find all the way to 1810 even. And it's always kind of phrased in a very, this person is an enemy of the state. In France in 1915, we've seen citizens who were considered enemies of the state denationalized. We've seen citizens in Belgium in the World War, for example, who were anti-national, being deprived of their nationality. So the phrasing and kind of the way that governments try to justify denationalization of nationality is always, this person is not good to be as part of the citizenry. And really, it's very much the manipulation of the situation for political gains. And of course, one of the bigger examples is that of Nazi Germany and the denationalization of the Jews. But whatever the reason is, just the point that I wanted to kind of highlight is that there are international legislations and safeguards that are really important that safeguard the right to nationality. And I feel like why it's important to bring them up, whether they're being respected or not in the country that we're talking about, is because, first of all, these international safeguards are being manipulated and used wrongly. I have listened to Bahraini media a few times where some politicians have actually quoted some of the articles from the statelessness conventions, for example, to say that what we're doing is actually in line with our international standards. So I think it's very important for us to kind of know what the international standards are, because they're very clear, to be able to kind of counteract those sorts of arguments. And citizenship, since it was citizenship stripping, since it was no longer seen as democratic and was very much prohibited, its prohibition is very much anchored in international human rights law. And I think that's kind of a very important point to know and to kind of be able to discuss. Even the conventions that Bahrain is ratified and signed up to, the right to a nationality and not to be deprived of nationality is heavily prescribed for in a lot of the conventions. I won't go through a list of them, but there are many. Just to kind of underline the point that it's not a gift to those who you feel should belong to the citizenry, it's a right for those to have and to have their nationality. And there are long-standing and strong international legal frameworks, and they all obligate states to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill everyone's right to a nationality. And you see often when Bahrain responds to some of the questions that are brought up under different UN mechanisms, under the UPR mechanism, under CRC, CEDAW, it does try and justify what it's doing. There is an element of trying to justify this arbitrary deprivation of nationality under the international legal framework. And I think it's important to know that it is very much safeguarded in international human rights law. One of the worrying things is that, unfortunately, when looking at kind of the fact that there is this international safeguarding, but maybe perhaps not an international political will to safeguard, is that there is an increase in other countries utilizing this deprivation of nationality as a form of a political tool. We see it everywhere. We see it in many Western countries now, where there's a growing number of countries that have expanded governmental power to deprive their citizens of their nationality. So this has added an extra challenge to countries like Bahrain, who are trying to seek support and influence from other countries. When you see, Canada and the UK and other countries also expanding their kind of powers in depriving their citizens of their nationality. So this is kind of one of an additional problem that we do face in the more international, broader scene. It is important as well that there are tools as well as international kind of legislation that are useful, I think, if we're trying to really bring together a strong legal argument. And one of the kind of more recent tools, which I would like to just highlight, is the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, which also has a mandate for statelessness, has recently put out some guidelines which specifically talk about deprivation of nationality and what states aren't and aren't allowed to do. So it's a strong tool to have if you are trying to bring together an argument or to respond to some of what the Bahraini government or the government supporters are saying. This tool is a strong tool to be able to kind of have with you to argue, which is, it's not a difficult argument to make, obviously, in terms of human rights generally, but also in terms of international law, it's important to be able to make that argument. So reality, kind of the takeaway that I just wanted to kind of bring to this discussion is, unfortunately, it's not a new thing, but because of that, there has been a real development of international legal safeguards. What we'd need to push for more is international political willingness, because of this growing utilization of citizenship as a political tool amongst many countries to try and support what you guys are trying to do in terms of stopping and reversing this practice of illegally, arbitrarily depriving Bahrainis of their right to a nationality. So I'll end there to give, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zara, for the sharp discussion on statelessness and its international dimension. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, our last two speakers were unable to join the event. We would have loved to hear their input in our discussion and apologize for that. We will now move on to a Q&A session. Please feel free to write any questions for our panelists in the chat. Sabiha and I will make sure to ask these questions directly to our speakers.
We have our first question asked on social media for MP Wayne David. If the Labour Party was the majority in the UK Parliament, what actions or decisions would they make on the issue of citizenship revocation in Bahrain?
Shall I respond to that now? Right. One of the things which we've set out as a Labour Party is a redefinition of our relationship with the world. It sounds very grand, but basically what our approach will be regarding foreign policy, defense policy, and trade and development rights and so on. And what we want to do is to make sure that all aspects of our foreign work pulls in one direction. So you don't have different government departments pursuing different policies, which is often the case at the moment. And therefore, it's extremely important that we define very clearly what are the principles which underlie our foreign policy relationship with the world. And one of the key things which we are stressing very strongly is the need to advocate and uphold human rights, whatever the situation, whether it be in Russia, China, whether it be South America, the Middle East, or indeed Bahrain. And we think that is so important. And linked to that is the adherence to the rule of law, both domestically, which our own government unfortunately is not too keen on these days, but internationally as well. In our relations with the European Union and with other countries, and with upholding international covenants and agreements and laws, whether it be through the United Nations or other international bodies. We think that is extremely important. So what I'm getting to is that undoubtedly, in my view, when we get a Labour government, we'll be saying very, very clearly that if we are to have a good relationship with Bahrain, we need to have a much firmer adherence to international law and human rights. And yes, some people say, well, you have to respect the cultures and the traditions of certain countries. Yes, I think that is absolutely correct. But I believe very strongly there are certain universal values which should apply to all countries in all situations for all time. And freedom of speech and democracy are part of that. And I think that is extremely important if we are to get a Labour government which stands for good in the world. I think that we can be a beacon of hope for many people and set a very good example and be a practical instrument which will help people throughout the world who haven't got the same sorts of freedoms that we've got in this country.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Wayne? Is that okay, Sabiha? Okay. We have recently seen this question about sleaze and corruption and so on. How much does lobbying play a role in convincing the British government or keeping the British government giving unequivocal support to the regime? We know this, just to complement this question, that some of senior ministers, including foreign ministers of the UK's foreign minister becoming an advisor to dictators, to Saudi Arabia, for example, at this moment of time. Okay, how can you as Labour Party, how can you stand to stop this? Because I cannot, me as a Bahraini opposition whose nationality has been revoked for many years. I only enjoyed my nationality for 1 year in the past 42 years, only for 1 year. Not all these 42 years since 1979 until today, I never had Bahraini nationality except 2001, and they took it after a few months. So. But still, I can see that the government here, the Conservatives, are not ready to change an inch or their position with regards to these dictators. So how can we make a change? Thank you.
That is a very good question. I mean, it sounds very, very pious, but I believe that all politicians in the Labour Party and most politicians generally are involved in politics to try and create a better country in a better world. There are plenty of ways which many of us could make a lot more money if we were outside of politics. But I think that morality is extremely important. And I don't mind saying I consider myself to be a very moral person. I believe there is good and there is bad. And I believe that my mission in politics is to speak up for good. And that's what we try and do. And where we see bad, as we've seen bad in the House of Commons with some of our Conservative colleagues, we do not hesitate to call that out. And we think that's extremely important because, there is no country in the world which is perfect, but democracy is perhaps the best form of government that human beings have devised. Yes, there are plenty of problems with democracy, but nevertheless, democracy is good and it needs to be protected and enhanced. And we think absolutely central to that positive view of democracy is that people should, first of all, be open and transparent. And in a democracy, if people are elected by the electors, then the responsibility is to those electors, not to some other organization or body or company which comes along and offers some large sums of money. It's as simple as that. And I don't mind saying I'm elected by the good people of Caerphilly in South Wales, and I receive no funds from outside organizations or foreign bodies or companies. I simply have my salary, and it's a very good salary as well too. And I just think that it's such an important principle to uphold. And I would translate that also into the international stage as well. And I think it is extremely important that some members of the Conservative Party receive large sums of money from abroad. Dare I say, the Conservative Party, it is alleged, receives large money from Russian oligarchs. And I'm quite sure they don't give large sums of money because they like the individuals concerned. They want rewards for their investment. And I just think that is morally wrong. And, I believe that Keir Starmer, for example, as a human rights lawyer himself, has very, very high moral standards. And I think that's important on the national stage and an international stage as well.
Thank you very much for these questions. We have a first question in the chat from Camille. What happens to people whose citizenship is revoked? Are they then automatically forced to exile? Anyone who wants to reply, you can go ahead.
Well, as far as I know, those whose citizenship had been revoked have been deported in the last 10 years. Hundreds who have been deported. Those who remain behind are denied their basic things. They cannot just go and join schools or hospitals. But my understanding is that most of those whose citizenship have been revoked were either outside the country before the citizenship was revoked, or had been put on an airplane and sent to Lebanon or to Iraq or to the neighboring countries.
We have another question here from Rebecca. What kinds of means can we use to improve our relation with Bahrain? And whoever wants to answer, feel free to answer.
Put it to Zahra.
I'm not sure I'm the right person. I don't represent any government or anyone trying to build relationships with Bahrain. I mean, the only thing from completely from my perspective, not about state relationship, is also an element of, what I mentioned before in terms of when we talk about an issue and try and put it on the agenda to really kind of put those which is very much a really good case study in Bahrain, but put those who are directly affected not only on the table, but leading the discussions. And I think that really is the case in Bahrain. and also for states to lead by example, which unfortunately really isn't the case with regards to deprivation of nationality. I think when we want to talk about this issue as you know, respecting the right to nationality, we really should also be trying to lead by example. And I think that's an important part, but I'm definitely not the right person to answer questions about state relationships.
We have a third question from Louise Zafra. Is intergenerational citizenship revocation happening in Bahrain? And what consequences does this have in children's rights ground?
I could answer. So absolutely, it's not that children are being stripped of their nationality yet, although that wouldn't be a surprise if that becomes a thing. It's more that because an individual is stripped of their nationality, that will affect the status of their children, and will also affect any newborn children because the mother, if the mother is Bahraini, can't give her nationality to her children. Or if her mother is from one of the stateless communities in the country. So yes, we are seeing many cases, some born in the UK, of a child being born as stateless because they can't obtain their Bahraini nationality. So it is becoming an intergenerational problem.
Well, I can say that some of my children are not able to get their citizenship. Their grandchildren, my grandchildren, have no passport now because they sometimes I'm not claiming that is used extensively, but sometimes others are punished for the crime or supposed crimes of their fathers and mothers. So this is going on. I tried my best not to talk to my family for many years now, my sisters, my brothers who are there in the country, because fearing for retribution. So when you have such a government, you do not know how they react. They think that by talking to your family, you are provoking them. You are not supposed to be talking to anybody. You are not a Bahraini. We have taken away your citizenship. And how many times they wrote about us in the press? Why do these foreigners talk about our country? And we must be, please take this information. We are the natives of Bahrain. We have been there for hundreds. I'm not saying thousands, but our fathers were from the country. It is the ruling family which is not from Bahrain originally, and they came to Bahrain about 220 years ago, and they occupied the country by force. So we go to 500, 600, 700, 800 years in history. Of course, we cannot say that those who came, say, 50 years ago are not Bahrain. No, they can be naturalized, no problem. But they shouldn't have the priority over the natives. We are the natives, according to the British Foreign Office documents. If you go there, they will talk. They call them the Baharna. These are the natives, and we are the natives. But so we should not be stripped of our nationality, neither us nor our children. But they do pay the price sometimes.
We have another question here from someone from the office of Stephen Timms. Are there any parallels between the approach of Bahrain here and the revocation being done by Western governments with terrorism suspects?
I don't know who wants. Ask somebody, either Zahra or Wayne, and then I can add a little bit later. But let us ask the other to see if Wayne can. I don't know. Probably this is not Wayne's specialty because you are talking about Bahrain. But I am sure he will say something, and then I may add something else.
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, really, because if I'm frank with you, I'm not completely au fait with what other European governments are doing with regard to the rights of suspected terrorists. I would suspect, however, there's a big difference between what certain European governments are doing and what the government of Bahrain is doing. Because, you know, depending on the amount of information that's been collected by different governments, these are individuals who are strongly suspected, if not we're in the situation of hard evidence being produced of committing, you know, quite serious crimes, which involve violence against individuals or against the state. I think we're talking about a situation in Bahrain where people are being denied freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of association. So I think the denial of freedoms is very, very different and done for different reasons. So I suspect, I mean, it's always a difficult question to answer because I don't have enough information. I suspect the parallels are quite false. And the situation in Bahrain, as has been described, is quite appalling and in many ways quite unique, because I'm not aware of any other country which has been denying citizenship in quite the same way as Bahrain has been doing it.
If I may also add to that, definitely from my perspective and someone who's worked on some cases, I think the specifics are very different. I think obviously Bahrain's more general human rights approach is much more appalling, denying of freedom. But I think in terms of not respecting the right to nationality and violating the right to safeguard someone's nationality, whatever they've done, and, you know, highlight that none of these people have been charged for of anything in a country which respect rule of law. None of these individuals have been charged for anything, and there's elements of second degree of suspicion of being in contact with someone of terrorism. It's actually really, really bad. So in terms of the respect of, you know, everyone has the right to a nationality under international law, respecting that and safeguarding that, I think there are parallels to be drawn, actually, especially when none of these individuals who have been deprived of their nationality have actually been convicted of anything. I don't like to parallel it because, you know, there are suspected terrorists potentially, and, you know, there are human rights defenders in Bahrain, and you know, who are trying to be kind of painted with the terrorist thing. And so that's why I don't like to parallel that, because that's feeding into Bahraini propaganda, paralleling these two. But at the same time, if we're looking at state practice, it's very problematic. Of course, with Bahrain comes a whole host of other human rights violations, which would affect those affected by sort of British citizens, because they're kind of left in other countries and are unable to return to the UK, like those unable to return to Bahrain. But it's a problem. It's problematic in this kind of not safeguarding the right to nationality across the board when we are trying to influence and trying to make a difference in what's happening in Bahrain as Western countries.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Saeed, do you want to add to?
I agree with Zahra very much. Of course, Wayne has already talked about the issue of terrorism. Look, the revocation of citizenship in Bahrain is not done through course. It is just by a decision, decrees. So the decree one day on the 6th of November 2012, we saw all the newspapers in Bahrain receiving the news from the Ministry of Information that these peoples have had their citizenship revoked. 31 names. I was the number one on that list. That is the first time in this era, apart from the past, that the first citizenship revocation took place on the 5th or 6th of November 2012. Now, who decided that? Who took the decision? Which court? What decree? It is just that it is just put in that vague that these people have had their citizenship revoked. So it is not a due process of law. We were not charged. We were, of course, I was sentenced in the military court once or twice to life imprisonment, but I was never brought to, with regards to my nationality, I was never challenged on that. And none of the others were challenged, and none was given the chance to go and challenge that right, because some of them were within a week or two, they were out of the country. So it is totally different. Here, one point I want to emphasize and wish Wayne David to take it up at some stage: definition of terrorism. What constitutes terrorism? It is a vague term that is being used by Saudi Arabia, by Bahrain, by the Emirates to deny their citizenship, their rights under this term, this vague term of terrorism. To me, in Bahrain, criticizing the regime is terrorism, amount to terrorism. Using the word. Now, Dr. Atsingais is sent to life imprisonment as a terrorist while he is on his crutches. He cannot move. He has polio from birth, okay? Because he is challenging the regime. Challenging the regime amounts to terrorism. So I hope one day there will be an international agreement under the auspices of the United Nations to define terrorism in a less vague way.
Thank you very much. We have Rahid Jahar who arrived in the event, so we will have him speak for a little while. Rahid Jahar, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Apologies about the misunderstanding with the time change. We just changed our time here in the US. And thanks again for inviting me. My name is Rahid Jahar. I am the advocacy director with DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now, the organization that was founded by Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you for all of the other speakers. I just wanted to add that the revoking citizenship has become a notorious tool for many governments in the region. It has been weaponized to crush dissent by a number of governments, including Bahrain. As other speakers have indicated before me, this is not only a violation of these citizens' rights in their countries, it is also a violation under international law for a few reasons. One of them is the right to citizenship, and the other is the right to movement, freedom to movement. Both of these get denied with taking away passports and other identification from people. Just in the last few years, we saw that Bahrain has used this tactic over 100 times. Egypt has joined the countries denying or revoking citizenship of activists and dissidents. So the case of Ghada Najib, who is currently stateless in Turkey, and being harassed by the Egyptian regime even after they took away her citizenship. There are a few other countries. UAE has stripped citizenship from many people, including families of political prisoners. More recently, this year, Israel has introduced a law that proposes revoking citizenship of Palestinian citizens of Israel in case they are convicted of so-called terrorism. So as we can see, there's a pattern there of weaponizing citizenship and also abusing the anti-terror framework to justify this oppressive tool of going after dissidents. Thank you for all the speakers, all the organizations involved here for monitoring this important issue and continuing to speak about it. And I just want to say that we at DAWN are very committed to following up on this issue, keeping it on our radar, and continuing to advocate with the US government and other governments to pressure Bahrain and other regional governments to stop these policies and reverse the decisions pertaining to citizenship. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raid, for that speech. We have one final question for Sabrina. How is it to be a journalist going to Bahrain and investigating human rights violations? Is it even possible to get some kind of reliable information from an organ different from the state?
It is quite difficult to go to Bahrain as a foreign journalist, and it's even more difficult, as you may guess, when you're a local journalist, because basically, if you want to be an independent journalist, you risk being jailed. But as a foreign journalist in international media, it's quite complicated to get to have transparency from the government. For example, when you want accountability regarding the case of Abdel Jalil al-Singis, they are very strong and very good at PR, but when it comes to transparency, you should not count on it. They most of the time ignore our statements. They ignore when we want to investigate on some crimes that have been committed. And sometimes, in rare occasions, they reply, which is kind of surprising. They want to show a goodwill, but they never follow up. And this is something we truly regret, and it should improve in the future. And once again, the situation won't improve if they don't release all political detainees, bloggers, human rights defenders, and if they don't accept to be more open towards press freedom and human rights.
We have Dr. Jalal Fairouz here who would like to say something.
Jalal, are you there? Maybe he is no. I don't think he is there.
Yeah, he is, but can
Yes, yes. Okay. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I was trying just to unmute, and I was just allowed to unmute. Right. Thanks for everybody who have intervened, and really, I have enjoyed listening to all of you. The same list which revoked the citizenship of the first top activist Bahrainis in like 10 years ago. Dr. Saeed Shabi was number one, the first one, and I was the last one on the list. And actually, it was out of the blue, without having to get any interrogation, without having been called and accused of anything, just because I was invited to go to the UK, and I was talking to the BBC there. Next day, my citizenship was revoked. The case is that the government of Bahrain has been just taking revenge of the activists who've been trying to advocate human rights and defend the violated people in Bahrain, and without anything at all, any accusation, any real legitimate reason, really. And for example, Sheikh Ali Salman, one of the top opposition leaders in Bahrain, he was accused of talking to the late Prime Minister of Qatar, and that was considered to be out of law. And even though he was at the time, he was the leader of a parliamentarian bloc in the parliament when I was also in the parliament at the same time. He was accused of that, and you imagine, just because Bahrain had bad relations with Qatar, and there was nothing the regime could do against Sheikh Ali Salman, because Sheikh Ali Salman was straight on the laws, So they just made up this situation, they put him behind bars for the rest of his life. Imagine. This is the situation in Bahrain. Unfortunately, I just to finish, I'll say that we found that the British government personnel have been defending and whitewashing the Bahraini government's black record of violations of human rights, and the British ambassador in Bahrain have been talking about the improvement of human rights in Bahrain, even though the world, all the freedom lovers, everyone of the independents, the prominent human rights organizations have been saying it's from bad to worse. So this is the situation. What can we do? I don't know. The world situation is that there is a support for the dictatorship. Sometimes they keep calm about the Saudis bombarding the Yemeni schools, and even the United Nations can't do anything about that because the United States and the NATO countries are defending the Saudis. That's the situation in the world, unfortunately. I'll stop here. I really thank you for the time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. For time constraint reasons, we will have to now end the Q&A session as well. I would like to thank all the participants for their insightful comments and questions to our panelists. I would like to especially thank our host, Wayne David, and all our panelists, Emna Saidi, Sabrina Banawi Raijar, and Dr. Saeed Al-Shahabi. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to hear from our other speaker, Emna. Hopefully in the future, we will hear her expertise in the matter. The discussions from this event has shown the depth at which citizenship is being used as a weapon by the Bahraini government. The growing rate of political denaturalization has added to the thousands of stateless individuals already living in Bahrain, who are at a heightened risk of experiencing abuses. We hope that this event has shed some light onto the extent of violations that have been occurring in Bahrain. We hope that this event, and we also hope that political leaders and human rights defenders have all suffered in the hands of this regime. Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singais, being one of the many prisoners of conscience who has been on hunger strike for over 100 days now. Hassan Mushema, an opposition leader, is also being slowly killed at Jau prison. These are only two of many individual cases in Bahrain that need to be addressed in order for them to be released. Therefore, we urge the UK government to support the democratic movement in Bahrain and the abolishment of the dictatorship currently oppressing the human rights of Bahraini citizens. Thank you all for attending today's event, as well as everyone that has helped this event to be successful. I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabiha. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Zahra. All of you, Sabrina.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.